welcomes you all this evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. I've prepared a special collection of night shift stories for you to enjoy. So, sit back, relax, and let the darkness take over as we dive into some chilling tales that are sure to send a shiver down your spine. Story Whispers of the Past. The old building stood silently in the heart of the city, a relic of a time long forgotten. Over a century old, it had served many purposes throughout its life. Once a bustling restaurant, it had transformed during Prohibition into a speakeasy, its underground tunnels hidden deep within. The basement, remnants of an era when men and women risked everything for a taste of forbidden liquor. The building had seen it all, the laughter of patrons, the whispers of deals made in secret, and the shadows of men and women whose stories had long faded into obscurity. I had worked there as a night janitor for nearly a year. The job was quiet, uneventful, and perfectly suited for someone like me, someone who didn't mind being alone with their thoughts and the occasional creaking floorboards. It was the middle of the night, around 2 a.m., when I found myself scrubbing down the long bar that had once hosted conversations that could alter the course of history. My rag dragged across the polished wood, and the sound of water sloshing in the bucket was the only thing that broke the stillness. As I moved from one side of the room to the other, I reached a narrow hallway that led to the pool room. A dim light flickered from the other end, casting strange shadows on the walls. It was then that I heard it, voices. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I was alone. But as I drew closer, the sound became clearer. 2 men were talking, their voices low but distinct. My heart skipped a beat as I approached the entrance to the pool room, the feeling that something was not right settling over me like a heavy fog. I rounded the corner to find them, 2 men, dressed in old Western attire. One wore a blue checkered shirt and the other, a red plaid one. They were both standing by an old pool table. A game in progress. The air around them seemed almost fluid, as though they were part of a dream rather than solid beings. I blinked, thinking my eyes were deceiving me. But when I opened them again, they were still there, moving with a strange, slow grace that made no sense in the real world. Their movements were smooth, almost floaty, as if they were hovering just above the ground. The way they played pool was unnatural, the balls rolling across the table with a fluidity that seemed too perfect to be real. I froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. I'd heard stories of this place being haunted, but I had never believed them. Yet, there they were, 2 men, playing pool in the dead of night. Their faces serene, as though they belonged to this time and place. Without thinking, I called out, "Hello, can I help you?" I didn't know why I said it. There was no logical reason to address them, they weren't real. But curiosity gripped me. I took a step forward, my shoes squeaking against the hardwood floor as I approached the table. The man in the red plaid shirt turned slowly to face me. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I could see nothing in them, no life, no emotion, just the empty gaze of someone who had long since departed from this world. And then, just as I crossed the threshold into the room, they vanished. The pool table, the men, the voices, all of it was gone. It was as though nothing had ever happened. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I had just witnessed. Had I been dreaming? Had I imagined it all? But the chill in the air and the sudden stillness that followed told me otherwise. I stood in the empty room for several moments, heart pounding, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that clung to me. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this place was not just a relic of history. It was haunted by the past, and I had just witnessed a glimpse of it. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I went about my duties, cleaning and organizing, but the thought of the men in the pool room lingered in my mind. I wasn't the only one who had experienced strange occurrences here. An acquaintance of mine, a former guard at a military base, had told me a chilling tale about his time stationed in the middle of an empty field. He had been assigned to watch over an old warehouse on the base, a place that had seen its fair share of dark secrets. Late one night, as he stood on his post, he heard the faint sound of a child crying in the distance. It was a sound that struck him to his core, an innocent, mournful cry in the dead of night. He was the only one there, or so he thought. His hand instinctively reached into his pocket, pulling out a small bag of candy that he always kept on hand. He had heard stories from other guards about a ghostly child who haunted the base, an apparition that would appear and disappear at will. The child had died in the 1970s, a victim of the military dictatorship that ruled Argentina at the time. The child had been caught trespassing on the base, but many believed the real story was far darker. Some said the child had been trying to escape the horrors of the regime and had paid the ultimate price for it. In any case, the story went that if you saw the child's ghost, you were supposed to toss candy over your shoulder, ensuring that the spirit wouldn't get too close. The candy was said to appease the child's restless soul. My acquaintance never saw the child, but he heard its cries often, and he always threw the candy just in case. He said it was the only way to keep the ghost at bay. Months passed, and strange things continued to happen at the bar. I began hearing footsteps. When no one was around, a heavy, deliberate sound that echoed through the halls. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow passing by a door, a flicker of movement in the hallway. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. One night, I met a police officer who had worked at the bar a few years before I had. He had been stationed there on the night shift and a fire broke out in the building. The fire claimed his life and the lives of others in the building that night. He had died, doing his duty, and his ghost was said to still haunt the place. The officer had told me that it wasn't unusual to hear the sound of footsteps, heavy, like those of someone wearing police boots, ascending the stairs. But no one was ever there. He said he wasn't afraid of the footsteps, though. They didn't bother him. He was used to the company of his fellow officers, even if they were no longer alive. I had almost forgotten about the strange happenings at the bar when another story surfaced, a story that would forever change my perception of the supernatural. A few years ago, not far from my parents' house, a bus driver had encountered something truly terrifying. The incident made national news, and I couldn't help but be drawn to it. The driver had finished his shift and was making his way to the end of the route, a stop near a cemetery. It was a quiet night, the bus almost empty save for the driver and a lone passenger. The lights were off, and the bus was nearly at its final destination. But then, both men saw her. A woman appeared in the middle aisle of the bus. She was young, blonde, and appeared to be in terrible condition. Her skin was pale, almost as if she had been dead for some time. A foul stench hung in the air as she moved closer to the driver. She carried a bag in her hand, and when she reached the driver, she opened it. Inside the bag was a severed human head. The woman spoke softly, asking the driver not to break eye contact with her. She explained that this was the end of the route, but she had to take another bus afterward. The driver and the passenger were paralyzed with shock, unable to speak or move. They both saw her, smelled her, and heard her voice. But when she vanished, they were left in a state of stunned silence. The driver tried to call for help, but the terror that had gripped him was not easily shaken. When his colleague arrived, both he and the passenger were so shaken that they couldn't drive the bus. In the end, a mechanic had to take over the bus, but even he wasn't spared from the unsettling events that followed. As the mechanic drove the bus, the bell above the door began ringing incessantly, as though someone was constantly pushing it. The GPS malfunctioned, refusing to work. And worst of all, the doors of the bus opened and closed on their own, as if something, or someone, was playing with them. It was a night none of them would ever forget. As I sit here now, reflecting on the strange happenings I've witnessed, I realize that some places hold the weight of history in ways we can't always understand. The past lingers in the air, haunting us in the form of shadows and whispers. The building where I work, the old military base, the bus route, all of them are connected by one thing: the restless spirits of those who have passed, whose stories remain unfinished. And sometimes, in the dead of night, if you listen closely. Story shadows in the quiet. A few years ago, I worked the graveyard shift at Best Buy. The holiday season was always a chaotic time for the store, but that year, for some reason, everything felt off. Maybe it was the long hours, the exhaustion, or the strange quietness that hung over the place when everyone else had gone home. Either way, it was just me and one other guy, working to restock the shelves and prepare for another busy day. I was used to the solitude. The store was practically empty at night, and the only sounds that filled the space were the hum of the fluorescent lights above and the soft shuffle of my feet as I moved up and down the aisles. I usually passed the time by listening to podcasts or music, anything to keep my mind off the darkness of the store, the vast, empty aisles that stretched on for what seemed like miles. But there was always that weird feeling, like something wasn't quite right. Something just beyond my sight, lingering in the corners. One night, I was standing near the electronics aisle, stocking up on DVD boxes when I saw it. It started as a slight movement, just a flicker at the edge of my vision, something I could have easily written off as my imagination. But the second time I saw it, it was clear as day. There was someone moving through the far corner of the store, jogging slowly in my direction, almost like they didn't want to be seen but couldn't help but move. My heart skipped a beat, and my stomach twisted. I was certain I wasn't imagining it. This wasn't the kind of thing that could be explained away. I froze for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. My first instinct was to glance over my shoulder, checking to make sure my coworker was still in the back, doing his own thing. He was. I knew it was just the two of us in the store. So who, or what, was moving in the corner? I turned back to the aisle, and just as I was about to convince myself it was all a trick of the light, I saw it again. The movement. It wasn't a person jogging this time, it was more like a shadow, shifting in and out of the dim light. It was fast, too fast to be a person, and the air grew cold around me. My skin crawled, and my breath quickened. Without thinking, I bolted toward the back of the store. I ran, full speed, like Usain Bolt had nothing on me. My heart pounded in my chest as I darted between aisles, my feet slapping against the floor in panic. When I reached the back, I slammed the door shut behind me, chest heaving as I leaned against the cold metal. "Hey, man, you alright?" My coworker's voice came from the other side of the room. He hadn't seen anything. Of course, he hadn't. I think I saw something, I said, trying to steady my voice. Like what? I don't know, like someone was here with us. He gave me a skeptical look. It's just us in here, man. You're probably just tired. The night shift messes with your head. I didn't believe him. My gut told me something wasn't right. There was something in that store, and I wasn't going to be the one to stick around and find out what it was. We pulled up the security footage to check for any unusual activity, but of course, there was nothing. No one had passed by the cameras. There was no trace of the shadow, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. But I knew what I had seen. That night, I realized that maybe, just maybe, ghosts were real. A couple of months later, I picked up a second job as a janitor for a small company. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills. The company had a contract to clean several buildings, most of which were old and hadn't been renovated in years. One of those buildings, an office in the heart of the old town, was especially creepy. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, dusty carpets, peeling wallpaper, and an air of decay that seemed to have soaked into the very walls. The first time I pulled up outside, something in my gut told me this wasn't going to be a normal night. The building loomed in front of me, dark and quiet, with a strange feeling that lingered in the air. The only light was from a small lamp by the entrance, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I grabbed my cleaning supplies from the van, feeling a sense of unease crawl up my spine. There were no other cars in the lot, no signs of life. It was just me, alone in a building that felt far too old to be empty. As I made my way inside, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The kind of silence that wraps itself around you, heavy and thick. The only sound was the slight shuffle of my shoes against the worn carpet as I made my way through the entrance hall. I flicked on the lights, but the place was still dim, as if the lamps had been designed to cast shadows more than illuminate. It was unsettling, the way the light only partially filled the spaces, leaving dark corners where I could swear something was watching me. I set to work, vacuuming and mopping the floor. The air was thick with dust, and it seemed to stick to everything: the walls, the floor, my clothes. Every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of something strange out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, nothing was there. I shook it off, chalking it up to tiredness. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I reached the back of the building, I turned a corner toward the bathrooms. That's when it happened. The bathroom doors were slightly ajar, but when I walked past, I heard something. A sound. Soft and subtle at first, like a creak. I stopped in my tracks. My heart began to race. I glanced at the doors again, but this time, something was different. The women's bathroom door was cracked open just enough to see the faintest sliver of darkness on the other side. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. My heart thudded loudly in my chest, and a cold sweat broke out across my back. I didn't know what to do. My brain screamed at me to run, but my feet refused to move. I stared at the door, feeling the weight of whatever had happened there pressing in on me. My stomach turned, and I felt a sickening tightness in my gut, like I was about to pass out. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, just watching the bathroom door. I couldn't bring myself to open it. I couldn't bring myself to move, even though every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave. But I stayed there, frozen, until the panic subsided just enough for me to think clearly. I turned around and made a beeline for the exit. I didn't look back. The next day, I didn't say anything to my boss about not finishing the cleaning. There was no point. The company wasn't interested in whether or not I'd finished every task. They just wanted the building cleaned. They never even asked about the bathroom that hadn't been touched. The next shift came around, and I never went back to that building again. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know what was in that bathroom, or why the door slammed shut on its own. But I do know one thing, whatever it wasn't human. Weeks passed, and I tried to move on. The Best Buy experience still haunted me, but I pushed it to the back of my mind. I threw myself into work, trying to forget the feeling of eyes on me in the dead of night. But one evening, I was driving home after another late shift, when I heard a story on the news that made my blood run cold. A bus driver had reported a strange encounter near a cemetery on his last route of the night. The bus was empty except for the driver and one passenger when the woman appeared. She was young, blonde, and disheveled, carrying a bag in her hands. When she walked down the aisle and stood before the driver, she opened the bag. Inside was a severed human head. The woman, with a strange calmness, asked the driver to keep eye contact with her. She explained that this was the last stop on her route, but she still had to ride another bus. Afterward, the driver, too terrified to respond, simply nodded. And when the woman disappeared as quickly as she had appeared, the driver and passenger were left shaken. The eerie part of the story was that when the bus reached the garage, all the doors began opening and closing by themselves, and the bells started ringing without any passengers boarding. The driver couldn't escape the oppressive sense of dread, and when the mechanic arrived to take over, he too experienced the haunting phenomena. I sat in my car, the weight of everything that had happened sinking in. The experiences I'd had, the feelings of being watched, the strange occurrences, they all clicked into place. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. The world was full of things we couldn't explain. Things that lurked just beyond our sight. Story whispers in the quiet. I never believed in ghosts. I'd heard the stories, of course, who hasn't? The spooky things that happen late at night when no one's around, the feeling of eyes watching you when you're all alone, the strange, unexplainable occurrences that happen in empty spaces. But I'd always chalked them up to overactive imaginations, stress, or simple coincidence. That was until I started working the night shift at a rehabilitation center for children. I had always worked the graveyard shift. It's the kind of job you take when you need the extra money but don't want to deal with the chaos of daytime hours. And the rehab center, though it had its fair share of emotional and psychological challenges, seemed like a safe enough place to work, even at night. The kids were asleep, the building was quiet, and the hours passed slowly but steadily. But one night, something happened that changed my entire view of reality. It was around 3 a.m. I was shampooing one of the daycare kids, a little girl who had recently joined us. She was only 3, and she had the sweetest blonde curls that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. The door to the daycare room was propped open with a heavy metal chair, as it usually was, to let in some air and to allow me to keep an eye on the hallway. The building was old, built in the 1950s, and had a strange, almost eerie feeling to it, especially at night. As I worked the shampoo into the little girl's hair, I heard something that made me freeze. A Soft giggle, light and melodic, but eerie in the silence of the early morning. It came from the hallway, just outside the door. At first, I thought it was one of the older kids sneaking out of bed. But as I looked up, I saw her, an adorable little blonde girl, not the one I was attending to, but one in a white dress-style nightgown, standing just outside the door. I didn't recognize her at all. "Hey, get back to bed, sweetheart," I called, a little annoyed but not thinking much of it. It wasn't uncommon for the younger kids to get out of bed during the night, and I had to keep a watchful eye on them. The little girl giggled again, a high-pitched sound that made my skin crawl. She ran down the hallway, her little nightgown trailing behind her as she disappeared around the corner. I quickly finished with the shampooing and followed her, calling out for her to stop and go back to bed. But when I turned the corner into the hall, she was nowhere to be found. I walked down the long corridor, peering into rooms, trying to find the girl. But there was nothing. I checked the mother's room, and to my surprise, the little girl was fast asleep in her bed, her matching pajamas a stark contrast to the nightgown I had seen her in. There was no way she could have changed that quickly. No way she could have run all the way down the hallway and back to her room that fast. My heart began to race, and a cold sweat broke out on my neck. I stood there for a moment, staring at the little girl sleeping soundly, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. That was the first night I truly started to believe in things I couldn't explain. After that night, I tried to shake off the feeling that something strange was happening. I went back to work every night, but my mind was always racing, my thoughts lingering on the little girl in the nightgown. Was I imagining things? Was it just a trick of the light? Maybe I had been too tired. But the feeling stayed with me, growing stronger with each passing shift. A few months later, I took on a second job at a local hardware store to make ends meet. Let's call it Gnome Depot, for the sake of anonymity. The store was pretty quiet at night, which is exactly how I liked it. It was one of those places where people came in to get the things they needed and left quickly, nothing exciting, nothing out of the ordinary. But then the weird stuff started happening. At first, it was small. A box or two would fall off a shelf for no apparent reason, even though the aisles were flat and clear of any obstructions. Then there were the disembodied footsteps that I could hear echoing down the aisles when no one was around. The worst part was the faint perfume smell that sometimes lingered in certain areas of the store. It wasn't a scent I recognized, but it was always there, hovering in the air, just enough to make my skin crawl. I mentioned it to my coworker, who shrugged it off as nothing. Probably just some other associates moving stuff around, he said. We've got a few other people working tonight, and they tend to wander off and forget to tell anyone. But that didn't explain the footsteps, or the perfume, or the feeling that I wasn't alone. The area where all these weird things happened was far away from the time clock and the break room. It was a dimly lit section of the store that most of us avoided unless we absolutely had to go there. Still, every night, I would hear the footsteps, or a product would fall off the shelf. And sometimes, I'd catch a glimpse of someone moving in the shadows out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, no one was there. By the time I started working at the library, I had fully embraced the idea that something was wrong with the world. The odd, unexplainable events had continued, but they had never been as pronounced as what I'd experienced at the rehab center or the hardware store. The library, though, well, that place was different. I worked the closing shift at a small local library. It was the kind of place that didn't get much foot traffic at night, especially after the kids had gone home. The library was always empty. After midnight, save for a few of us staff members finishing our shifts. Our job was to make sure all the lights were turned off, and the doors were locked before we left. It was a routine I hated. I was always jumpy, and the silence of the library after hours felt oppressive. One night, as I was going about my usual routine, turning off lights and checking the empty study rooms, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The lights in one of the study rooms flickered on. I knew that the room was empty because I had checked in the keys myself just minutes before. The lights in the rooms were motion activated, so I thought maybe someone had snuck in. But when I peered inside, the room was empty. I thought I was just being paranoid, so I continued my task, only for the lights in another study room to flicker on. And then another. Each time, I checked, but each time the rooms were empty. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't explain it. I went to the back office and told my boss the next day, and to my surprise, he wasn't shocked. "Yeah, we've had reports of stuff happening here for a while now," he said. Lights turning on by themselves, strange sounds, people feeling like they're being watched. Honestly, I think it's haunted. That was enough for me. I didn't need any more proof. Whatever was happening in that library, and in the rehab center, and in the hardware store, whatever I had seen and felt, wasn't just in my head. Something unexplainable was happening, and I couldn't deny it any longer. Now, when I walk through the quiet halls of the rehab center, or work the late shift at the hardware store, or check the empty rooms at the library, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. I've grown used to it, in a way, but it still makes my skin crawl. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear a soft giggle or see a shadow move in the corner of my eye. I don't know what's real anymore. But one thing's for sure, there's something in the dark. Something that's always watching. And no matter how hard I try to convince myself it's all just in my head, deep down, I know that I'm not alone. Hey everyone, Mort here. Thanks so much for tuning in and listening to tonight's stories. I really hope you enjoyed them. If you did, it would mean a lot to me if you could drop a like and hit that subscribe button. And if you made it all the way to the end and aren't subscribed yet, well, that'd be awesome too. I put out new videos every week, so I hope you'll stick around. A huge thanks to my amazing members and patrons. You guys rock, and your names are right there on the screen. If you like this video, I think you'll enjoy this one too, so why not give it a watch? Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.